All right. Welcome. Our topic today is modernizing data analytics in the cloud. And this topic is much bigger than just Power BI, if that's what you're used to. Today, we will talk all about the end-to-end processes, roles, services, and what it takes to make this all happen. For additional background on data in the cloud, make sure you check out Miguel's other blogs, Modernizing Data Estate with Microsoft's Enterprise Data Strategy and Enabling Unified Data Governance Across All Your Data Sources with Azure Purview. There are links to these topics at the end, so make sure you check them out at the end or after this show is over. With that said, joining me today is Miguel Wood. Miguel is Planet's Chief Enterprise Solution Architect, specializing in data services and a published author. If you have worked with him, you know that he's an all-around rock star in the data services. Additionally, Miguel has been with Planet for 11 years and resides in Dallas, Texas with his wife and two youngest sons. Welcome, Miguel, and thanks for being here today to discuss a different angle on data in the cloud.
Thanks, Ken.
All right. Okay, today we're talking all about analytics and the services in Microsoft that make the end-to-end process of analytics in the cloud possible. And just a quick set the stage here for the agenda today. Here's what we're going to be talking about. What does modernizing data analytics provide? And obviously you can read the whole screen, but basically we're going to give you the whole background of data analytics, what it is, how to get started, what roles you need to support this kind of effort, and what tools you can be used. So now let's do some housekeeping to know who's on the audience so we can understand and better tailor the discussion. So our first poll is coming up. Make sure you go ahead and answer it. These are anonymous, so don't worry to answer the questions in the chat window. You'll see it here shortly. This first poll question is just trying to figure out who's on the call today so we can tailor the discussion. Miguel and I would appreciate you telling us, what role do you consider yourself in your organization's data analytics platform? Are you a CIO, CTO level, data analyst, engineer, DBA, enterprise reporting specialist, or other? So go ahead and let us know what you're thinking here, where you're at. And it looks like we've got some results coming in right now. What do you think, Miguel? Lots of others, yes.
Lots of others. We got one CIO, CTO, so that's good, and 3 data analysts / engineers. I am surprised not to see any. Well, I guess I'm not surprised not to see any DBAs there, but I am very surprised not to see any enterprise reporting folks.
Yeah.
Although that sometimes can fall in that data analyst role as well, so they may actually be.
Others, right?
Yeah, that's true, or others, right?
All right. So let's get this started. So Miguel, tell us, what does modernizing data analytics provide?
So we're going to get into some of the classic data analytics, but modernizing data analytics really allows for us to take the power and availability of the cloud platform to adapt to and bring all this data. And we talk about data holistically, but we are dealing with massive amounts of data in our organizations. And most of the organizations also have that data siloed, whether it be in an application platform like an ERP, or whether it be in different locations. And the challenge, of course, is when you're making organizational decisions or looking to make change direction and understand what is going on in the organization, as well as maybe how to improve the organization, which is probably going to be the primary goal for a lot of the analytics piece. That is in utilizing the new technologies that we have available is the key thing. It also allows, as we continue with this massive collection of data, the data is no good unless we actually know how to act on it. So modernizing data analytics provides for it to scale, to bring in new data sources, whatever they may be, whether they be application platforms, whether they be outside data sources, and to be able to get the information you need to make decisions in a quicker way, and plan for the future of the business. Be able to understand, if I do certain things, what could that have as far as impact on the organization or the business.
Excellent. So who needs enterprise data analytics, Miguel?
I would argue that all organizations do, if they want to become efficient and actually increase their ability to provide the services they do, whatever organization that is, whether it's a business or government agency. The challenge that you, as I kind of mentioned, is when I start having multiple data sources and different silos, and I would argue that most organizations have a significant number, and they're growing constantly, especially as you use other cloud services such as software as a service. It makes it difficult to I think the slide says coordinate, but basically consolidate that data and actually use the data together as a big view to be able to
Yeah.
make those decisions. And it's challenging to make those decisions if the data is constantly changing, whether it be the number of data sources, whether it be expanding those data sources, adding additional information. Um, and the challenge here is we obviously have legacy data warehousing. When we start talking about data analytics, most of it comes from the classic data warehousing things. When I actually use classic data warehousing, it is very difficult to maintain because those changes have to be considered and be made all the way through the process from the data source to the warehouse and obviously then onto the visualizations and the reporting. So the modernizing or the modernization of enterprise data analytics actually addresses and takes care of those challenges that we have.
Right. You can imagine a whole organization trying to use the same data sources and not having that authoritative source that's been modeled and cleaned and ready to go, and everyone possibly modifying it, and then the results are just all a mess. So yeah, these are great points here.
That's an absolute very good point to make, because we run across a number of clients where they've taken, for instance, either Power BI or Tableau or some visualization, and their users with the self-service, the business intelligence visualization or BI visualization, they are hitting all these different sources and they're coming up with reports. But when someone else does the exact same thing, the data or the visualizations aren't showing the same type of data. And
Right.
that's a significant challenge that we run across, that organizations get frustrated with, because if you have two people looking quote unquote at the quote unquote same data and they have different understandings or different visualizations and get different information out of that, it makes it so that's confusion. It's confusion there.
Excellent. Well, let's get on to our second poll. What is your current data platform for analytics? Miguel and I are really interested in knowing, what is your current data platform? Are you using Oracle, SQL Server Data Warehouse, Azure Synapse Analytics, something else that we haven't mentioned, or just you don't know? So we're just kind of curious. We'll give it a second here and see what we're looking at here.
And I would argue this is the back end, right? This is the core engine of the data analytics, not necessarily the visualization.
Right, exactly.
Want to be clear on that question.
We do have a poll coming up on that one though next.
Yes, we do.
All right, so a little bit of everything. Looks like I'm surprised no Oracle yet, but interesting. About even on the others though. Excellent. Okay, so that should give you an idea of the folks we're talking with today and what they're using. All right, go ahead, Miguel. What is data analytics?
All right, so if we take a look at the definition, and this is one slide I will read, it's simply the process of identifying, cleaning, transforming, and modeling data to discover meaningful and useful information. This is, like I said, this is the one slide I will actually read verbatim, because we need to make sure that we're all on the same page as to what that process is for data analytics. So not only identifying, but cleaning and transforming could be arguably the same thing, although truly they're not. Cleaning is making sure that the data is correct. Transforming is more ensuring that I'm getting the right data that I need to in my analytics engine. Modeling provides that the data information to so that your visualizations, the people who are actually pulling that data are pulling all the same data, as we mentioned with that challenge before.
So talk to us about the steps and the different types of data analytics, Miguel.
Absolutely. So the first step, of course, is what are the data requirements? And I'd argue this is not necessarily the data requirements, but the business requirements for that data. What am I looking? So yes, I do have to assess all the data sources as understanding where it's grouped, what application platforms it may be on, what source systems, Oracle or a data warehouse or other pieces, whether it's app or SaaS data, from different SaaS applications. Once we actually determine what those sources are, assess those sources, and then we understand what the requirements are going to be able to use. What am I looking to get from that data? That's obviously going to be the primary piece, the very first step. The second, of course, is to collect it. In other words, when I collect it, I'm pulling it in to some type of system that makes it easy for me to do the cleaning, transforming, and modeling before I actually go ahead and serve that up. So you'll see that we collect it and then we actually then organize that. Now, in the classic data warehousing, we typically have a set schema. And for those people who have been around data warehousing, You'll hear them talk about star schemas and snowflake schemas, and those schemas are set. But our data today is not all structured data. In fact, I would argue that the majority of our data is truly unstructured, where we're talking about files or semi-structured that may be also coming from or having some type of semi-structure, but not rigid tabled columns, records, if you will, that are strictly defined.
Mm-hmm.
And then the final piece, of course, is that it's cleaned up. So when I say cleaning versus transforming, cleaning typically makes sure that I'm not dealing with duplication. It also makes sure that I'm actually getting the authoritative data from the sources. You may actually have the same points or same data points in two different systems, but which system is truly authoritative? And do I need to make sure and even raise alarms if the data in both of those systems are different? So there's also some feedback that can be provided back to the source systems, even in from your data analytics piece. When we talk about the types of data analytics, though, this is where what are we looking to get? And so normally the industry or the industry standard around data analytics has actually broken it down into 4 types. And you'll see that I actually say 4 types, but down below, you'll actually see me list 5 types in the slide. And by the way, these are, if you will, they are steps. They're actually maturity steps. So I don't go and jump straight to prescriptive analytics, which is that 4th bullet down. I literally have to make sure that I have some of these other ones before. So they build on each one. We typically talk about SQL data warehousing or just data warehousing. We talk about the historical data. We're always looking at historical data. And that is our primary piece, our descriptive analytics. What descriptive analytics is, what has happened? What do I know for a fact that has happened in the past? Once I have that information, I can actually use that and analyze that data to try and figure out why did it happen. And there may be external pieces here besides just the data that you have, right? And once I actually have why did it happen, which is built on what has happened, I can then start using technology and compute engines to try and figure out predictive analytics, what will happen. Now, the final one of all of that is prescriptive analytics, is what should be done to achieve a goal. In other words, what will happen if I do this? And so it is dependent on all 3 of the previous ones, because what you're doing is trying to change things and actually see, okay, what will happen or what would happen if I want to achieve this goal, or what is my goal to do? And that's where we get to the final one, where we really start using machine learning and artificial intelligence, ML and AI, to go and say, what might happen if I do this and I bring in other data, typically other data points. That is typically a heavy compute. We've seen some HPC stuff, high compute sources, where we actually start utilizing that in the classic sense or on premises. But those are our types of data analytics and those data analysis, basic data analysis steps. Sorry.
All right, that makes sense to me. And we're going to go on to our next poll, which is which visualization tool set do you currently use today for data analytics? And so this is kind of like, are you using Power BI? Are you not using anything yet? Have you not gotten there? Tableau, maybe another solution. So if you could just quickly throw it up there in the chat, which it's there, just go ahead and answer real quick. We'll see where people are at. And the results seem like they're coming in. I'm just kind of curious. We would like to, but we just haven't put anything in place yet for governance. So maybe they're kind of concerned about enterprise rollout of Power BI or some other solution without a well thought out plan. Okay, so it makes sense that most of the folks are using Power BI. This is a Microsoft centric type of conversation, at least the way we're having it today. So we would expect that to be there. It looks like there's a little bit of Tableau though.
There is, I think now in hindsight, and I guess I'll go ahead and admit this, you could obviously go ahead and use Excel or Access as well, as possible visualization tools as well, that because your Excel can go ahead, but Power BI comes from those power tools we used to have in Excel. That's right. Its roots there.
But you really want that visualization capability in data analytics, which is going to help you make decisions. Excel only goes so far, right? So that's why you take it to the next step.
I also like that we have a few people actually saying we would like to, but need a governance structure in place.
Yeah.
I'm going to say, I'm going to take a little deviation here. data governance is extremely critical, especially from an enterprise when we're dealing with a whole bunch of sources.
Right.
And if we actually did a You Already Own It before, and the blog post there on data governance with Azure Purview.
That's right.
One of the I want to mention one thing there is, if you want to see data lineage, in other words, you're looking at a Power BI report and you want to see exactly what table or what data source and what element in that data source and where that information is coming from, that visualization, you have that capability within Purview. But it also takes care of the security, being able to allow users to find where that data is. That's also another big challenge from a governance perspective.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
and
I
a
think
lot of
it's
people
like
get nervous
schematic,
about, yeah,
right? It's kind of like a
yeah.
schematic, right? You can see how everything's put together and understand where it comes from. And again, we do have that blog at the very end, so make sure you take a look at that and read over that blog, and as well as a video recording of that session. If you're interested, follow up with us, let us know. All right, so we'll now go into some more detail, laying out the process of data analytics and how it works. Warning, there's a lot of information coming over the next few slides, and there's obviously links to everything at the end of this presentation. So don't worry about taking notes. Everything that we're going to be going over here, there's links to it at the very end. And so let's go ahead and get started. Miguel, can you tell us a little bit about the products that provide analytics solutions in the Microsoft Azure suite?
Absolutely, thank you. And again, I want to set the expectations for this. We can dive a lot deeper, but we also wanted to make sure you understood the overview concepts of actually modernizing it. So what you notice on the screen is our typical, I've referenced before, our typical classic data analytics architecture, or most people would actually say sometimes data warehousing, and then obviously the analysis and reporting that occurs after that. Normally, this is the steps for the data analysis here. And it's going to be the same whether we actually use the modern or the classic here, is we prepare it, model it, visualize it, analyze it, and then manage it. Managing it is not something to lightly overlook, because it's typically never going to be a complete and go. But in this situation, we typically had SQL or databases, and we'd merge those all from multiple systems and merge them into a data warehouse and our data marts. And then we would do this analysis. That process that would actually go before the reporting. That process is your ETL, extract, transform it, and load it. And what that means is I'm extracting it straight from the SQL or the OLTP source. Again, this is primarily for structured data, by the way. We'll talk about the different types of data here in a second. And then I would load it into the data warehouse. That data warehouse would then be typically have the models associated with it, and then I would use which I do the analysis for, to create those models, and then actually go ahead and do the visual reporting. Whether that was Excel, whether that was Power BI, Tableau, it doesn't matter. There's many different visualization tools. Yeah. But the challenge here, let me go ahead and mention this. So what happens if I make a change on the data source, specifically a structured data source, whether I'm adding a database or maybe modifying that database and adding columns? I have to make those changes all the way through this pipeline, if you will. I have to make the change is being done at the source. That means I also have to update my data warehouse and all the schemas that are applied to that. And I have to update all those models as well before I can actually get that. And so that process of being quick to make those changes is a very painful process and typically takes a significant amount of time, or a significant amount of resources to do, because normally this is going to be different roles that handle this all the way across. So the coordination becomes really an issue there. So that data pipeline, if you will, is very critical in understanding that. We're going to start briefly mentioning about where we move to with the cloud compute resources and the analytics resources we have specifically in Azure, where we start moving to an ELT, where I don't care right now that I have a whole bunch of sources. I'm simply going to load it into my analytics engine, and then I'll do the transforms when I need it. And to an extent, Power BI can do some of this, but when I start talking about more data and more silos, it becomes much easier to put it into an analytics engine per se.
Gotcha.
So let's talk about, if you wouldn't mind, let's talk about the pipeline. So the pipeline is, and we've kind of touched on this briefly before on the data analysis steps. This is where we actually start transforming it over into the technologies. So the ingest pipeline, or the portion of the pipeline, you'll see this in our architecture diagrams. That's one of the reasons I'm actually showing or mentioning this data pipeline, is where we actually collect the data and get it into moved into a system where it's going to be a centrally stored system. Then we actually do the data processing, or the preparing of that, and that is going to be your analytics, your core analytics engine. All right, and it's can be stored in a database, but you're going to start seeing where we have unstructured and semi-structured, where I may actually just simply use a storage mechanism like a data lake. And then we move into the data modeling. So we can do modeling both on the analytics engine side, the backend platform. We can also do the data modeling in Power BI. In an enterprise Power BI, and I'm using that only as an example, you can do this with most other enterprise reporting visualization tools. We can create those data models that my users that are creating those reports and looking to visualize the data and or make those decisions can also create those as well. Again, I want to refer back to the challenge we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, where if I have a whole bunch of these, I'm not creating a, if you will, organizational, departmental, or team level models, data models. I may have two people trying to model the same information, but maybe add other data sources or leave other data sources out, and so your visualizations may not be consolidated or similar. You're going to get different pieces there.
Yeah.
Now there's also, when we talk about the back end, what happens about if I'm dealing with massive amounts of data coming in the system, and we start talking about streaming analytics. And that streaming analytics, it allows for things like log analytics from analyzing computer systems and servers and machines to IoT devices, and the data that they're providing, whether, for instance, if I'm monitoring temperatures throughout warehouses throughout the country, or other things like that. Right. Those kind of things are not going to be something I'm going to have Power BI do, but that's where we start, again, to talk about back-end analytics systems. And then finally, of course, the last one, of course, is acting, decision making. So once I've actually created those data models, how are they going to be created, and made them available based on what my requirements were and what I'm looking to do? Then I do the visualizations, and actually can do my decision making to make those acts, if you will, make those decisions and actions to do what I'm looking to do.
Gotcha.
There's obviously a lot more. I'm not going to read the slide, but there's a lot more as we get into some of those things.
Yeah. So we're going to go over some end-to-end processing. So we're going to go over some of this again, right?
Right.
Okay. All right. So let's keep this moving. And so tell us about the roles that are needed to provide a modern data analytics platform.
Yeah, and a couple of these roles have been referenced in some of the in the details of the previous slides and in the small and some of those things. The first two that I want to mention are the business analyst and the data analyst. Well, what's the difference between them? First of all, I would argue that the business analyst is closer to understanding what the business is looking for. So the key differentiator there is what they typically do with the data. So the business analyst is closer to the organization and interpreting the data that comes from the visualization, where the data analyst actually enables and actually has more of the overall understanding of the data to meet that. We'll talk about combining some of these different roles, but in a moment. But right now, those are two different roles. So the data analyst is also responsible for the management of the reporting and visualization assets. That would be the reports, the dashboards, and if you're doing the data sets or what we'd call data models in that reporting platform, they would also probably be responsible for that as well. The data engineer is the one that actually sets up the platform technologies that are, whether they're on the premises or whether on the cloud. This is not a database administrator, but they manage the flow of the data from different multiple sources. Think of this person as actually handling your ingestion, typically, of multiple different data sources. If one of those data sources is a database, and obviously it has a database, typically those have database engineers or administrators as well. But this data engineer is looking at the big picture and handling that. There is some alignment, or can be, I guess, some alignment between the data engineer and data administrator, but the engineer scope is beyond just the database. They do data engineers do. They're not the data analysts or business analysts, but they can coordinate with business stakeholders to identify and meet those data requirements I'm needing. The next one, the data scientists, that's think of that as it's arguably the newest role that we actually have in data analytics, but they're the ones that could maybe be doing advanced analytics to basically get the some of the more value from that data.
The cognitive stuff, like you're thinking?
Say what?
Like the cognitive type of
Yes, it is. That's exactly it. So
yeah.
while they might actually work in descriptive analytics, their descriptive analytics is probably less than it is on the predictive analytics that we talked about, or cognitive, to your point. The data scientists typically doing the advanced analytics that are in the last three data analysis types we talked about. Remember,
Right.
they're a maturity model. So moving into the predictive and cognitive is really where you're going to see that. They work hand in hand, obviously, with the data engineer, but they're the ones that are going to do a lot of your advanced analytics. The last, of course, I think everyone knows the DBA.
Yeah.
Yes, there's so many. I'm not going to give any jokes about being a DBA. I started my career as an Oracle DBA, so I understand that. But DBAs do still have, and they do have a growing need. They do work it, but they're going to be more of the operational aspects of the data platform. I would argue you're seeing their roles expand into possibly some storage as well, but they're still typically mapped to solely OLTP or arguably even OLAP, and that's your data warehousing pieces. When we talk about this, they're typically platform specific, being SQL Server or Oracle or other types. But again, most DBAs nowadays, I would argue, are expanding their roles into multiple platforms and hybrid cloud pieces as well. If especially if they're trying to stay current with what in the database administrator role.
So, Miguel, if you're an organization who's just getting started, what approach would you use to fill these roles, specifically like a smaller organization that doesn't have dedicated roles? What would you suggest to them?
That's a great, and I love this because, okay, so we're defining all these separate roles, and I would actually say they could be possibly skill sets, but obviously in a smaller organization or in an organization, even a large organization that is just starting their data analysis journey or data analytics journey, the first two is the most obvious where you can actually combine. The business analyst and data analyst can actually be filled by one person. And then your data engineer and data scientist are also another one. I would argue that would probably be the next one that you possibly combine. Your DBA, again, without throwing any jokes out there, is typically going to be the one that is not there. Now, having said that, however, I've seen many database administrators or DBAs move into these other roles as well. So it really depends on the skill set that the DBA has. DBAs, if they have a very good understanding of the business or the organization goals and so forth, they may be able to move into and provide some of that information, at least on the data engineer side. On the data scientist side, so can one person fulfill all these roles in a small organization? Yes, they can. It does take some ramp up because you are adding skill sets beyond obviously any one. It's harder to go from the top down than it is to go, well, technically, it's hard to go from the top down than it is going from the bottom up. However, I argue that some of our old classic, and again, to the joke, your DBAs may not be as business savvy, and they may not understand that. So if you have someone who's business savvy that understands a little bit about the data, it's going to be an easier move. The DBA understands a lot about the business, they could actually move or gather those skill sets above. So yes, the DBA typically will actually, at least at the very, if I'm talking about two people, DBA would typically take those last three, and your analyst would take the first two, or in three, it'd be the first two, the second two, and then obviously the DBA. And yes, it could be one person. So.
Sure. Okay, let's keep this moving, and we're going to start with our series of architecture slides, starting off with the least complicated, right?
Yes. So this is meant to be the least complicated one, because when you see the final one, it's going to be kind of an all end, all up. This is your classic or basic data warehousing and analytics. And there are obviously some product pieces here. This, by the way, and you'll see the links at the end of the thing. This is coming from the Azure architecture piece. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the data sources. You'll notice that we have the ingestion, storage, analysis, and visualization, very similar to what we saw up above on the data pipeline as well. But you'll see we see SQL Server and other relational databases. Maybe it's Oracle or Azure SQL. All of these here would be OLTP sources. What I do want to call out is that you're noticing storage tables. So we're talking about either a storage table or blob storage that that may actually have semi-structured information, and or Cosmos DB as well, where I'm starting to get into semi-structured or unstructured data. Notice the piece in the orchestration. So I'm moving into the second one, or the second block called orchestration. We see this storage blob where I have storage, but I want to be careful on that, because yes, I could throw everything in storage blob, but we actually have built on blob storage is Azure Data Lake, and we'll talk about that and grow that in. But I'm ingesting it and throwing everything into that location. Do I see anything there about SQL or a SQL data warehouse? Not necessarily yet. However, what I do see is the next thing is storage as Azure Synapse Analytics. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about Azure Synapse. I'm going to go ahead and preview this right now. Azure Synapse is not one single technology. It's going to be a group of technologies. Most of those technologies are also individually available. An example of that is what you see there in the orchestration, or what I would use or call for the ETL process of Azure Data Factory. That's the lowest icon in the very bottom. Azure Data Factory is your cloud platform as a service offering that does the ETL, or the extract, transform, and load. So for those people in the Microsoft realm or SQL Server realm, that's basically SSIS as a service, if you will. And in fact, does plug into SSIS on-prem if you already have some of these packages done. Once I actually move to the right-hand side, I also see Azure Analysis Services. Again, this is a standalone piece, but I also have pieces within Azure Synapse Analytics that can do this as well. Yes, it has the Azure Active Directory, because we're typically using Azure AD to access those pieces. And then the visualization is Power BI. Yes, this is Microsoft centric. And yes, there are other pieces or other vendor technologies that can handle some of the visualization, as well as obviously on the data source side as well. So this is your basic data warehousing and analytics at a very basic level. We're going to get a little bit more advanced after we talk a little bit more about Azure Synapse. So as I mentioned, what Microsoft has done, and for those that know Synapse Analytics, it's only been around for a couple years, so it's a relatively new. But what you'll also notice is that it's also growing. It started off as simply the replacement for Azure SQL Data Warehouse, or DW. And what they did was they renamed it to Azure Synapse Analytics. But Azure Synapse became a brand. And when I mentioned on the previous slide, I said all these things you start seeing are individually able to be utilized as individual services in Azure. But if you've worked with Azure in the Azure portal before, you'd know that you'd actually go to each one of these different resources and have to manage them separately and do all that. So a whole bunch of different technologies here. I'm not going to read them, but the primary one that started this all was the SQL Data Warehouse, the Azure SQL Data Warehouse on the left hand, I guess about the 10 o'clock on the there. Yes, thank you. And I also want to call out Azure HD Insight, because that's when we start dealing with large or big data. Everyone talks about big data. That's Microsoft's implementation of the Hadoop, Apache Hadoop. Now, and that's kind of where it gets the HD Insight. But be aware, HD Insight also has been expanding significantly to include other big data industry, most of them all Apache, by the way, big data capabilities. I'm going to talk about some of these other things, but what you see is the customers actually came in and actually utilized all these one thing. And what Microsoft has done is basically brought it all under a single end user or end-to-end experience called Azure Synapse Analytics. And so now I have this single entry point to get to all those things. For example, even though Azure Data Factory is a standalone service, as I mentioned, it's kind of like your ETL PaaS. In Synapse, it's actually called Azure Pipelines. Now, they're not identical. The technologies underneath them are identical, but there are little key differences, and obviously how I access it, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Because once I have this is our logical or component architecture of Azure Synapse Analytics as it stands. And one of the things I want to call out is the second blue, where it says Synapse Studio. Synapse Studio is the single entry point or single pane of glass, as you'll hear said over and over again, to handling all of your analytics in Azure Synapse. Now, having said that, understanding that it's a single pane of glass, and that's why it looks like it's the single end user experience we talked about. If I go all the way down to the bottom and start at the bottom, you'll also see some other things here. So right there where he's pointing, he's showing Synapse Link, and what I see is Synapse Link has different data sources. Now there's a little minor little data source on the far right, Dataverse. And for those that are not familiar with Dataverse, it's the renamed or component called Enterprise Data Catalog that you find in Dynamics, CRM, etc., as well as your Power Platform.
Yeah.
So all that stuff that you have in Power Platform is also able to be utilized and pull straight in and analyzed within Azure Synapse. That's a big thing. And so the Synapse Link, think of it as a direct connection to some data sources, and they continue to add. This is where you actually see a lot of the newest features, is that Azure Synapse continues to add Synapse Link for different sources, whether it be SQL database, which is the Azure PaaS, whether it's SQL Managed Instance, the actual Managed Instance PaaS service, or whether it's SQL Server residing in Azure or on-prem, Cosmos DB. And then I also have some other data stores. Event brokers, think of that as your IoT and typically your streaming pieces. Data lakes, whether it's Azure Data Lake or other things, and then of course a SQL data warehouse as well. So those data stores are also capable or within and can be accessed through an Azure Synapse workspace. For instance, the classic Azure SQL data warehouse that was the first component of Azure Synapse, that's actually going to be called your dedicated pool or SQL pool that we'll talk about. So the runtimes, I have different runtimes available on top of that. The Spark is for that streaming, typically. That's the Apache Spark information engine. You have the SQL engine. So if I want to ensure that I'm able to query all of my data wherever it resides in my data stores, I would actually ensure that I have a SQL. Now here's the kicker. Everyone knows that SQL, whether I'm talking about compute or whether is typically an expensive engine to run. And if anyone's actually looked at the cost, it's relatively expensive, I should say. That doesn't mean that I have to run it all the time. One of the things you'll see in the analytics runtime is I have dedicated SQL pools as well as serverless pools. What serverless pools are container-based as I need it. So I'm only spinning up that compute and therefore only paying for that compute when I'm actually using it. It's kind of on demand. So this actually has a lot of information on making sure that I'm not paying. When people typically did legacy data warehousing, I had to pay a lot for the compute and for the servers that would run that data warehouse, not only for storage and everything else. Obviously, on the top, you see all the different pieces. I mentioned Purview from a governance perspective. That's the purview where I can start looking at and visualizing, getting that lineage, as well as governing all of this from a secure perspective, from tagging perspective, everything else. Machine learning, the next one. Data share. Again, I'm not talking a lot about that here, but if you've not looked at Azure Data Share, this is specifically for organizations to share data securely with trusted partners. This is huge. This is a big thing, but it's also extremely relatively new. And then of course DevOps to maintain and actually have operationalize basically your processes, and of course Power BI for visualizing. So, but this whole thing below is actually what would be considered Azure Synapse Analytics engines, if you will, or pieces. So as I mentioned, this is one of the things, and I always tease my Microsoft friends about this. You guys are awesome about the technologies, but sometimes your marketing kind of messes it up because it confuses people because we're renaming things and changing things. For anyone coming new into it, it's actually, oh, this makes sense completely. But anyone who's been around, we sometimes feel that pain, if that makes sense. I apologize to the Microsoft folks on the call, by the way.
We got about 10 minutes left because I want to save some time for questions. So
no problem. I'm going to break this down into two sides, and we've actually talked about this already. The top one, there's crosses that streaming. So you'll actually see event hubs and stream analytics jobs. everything that you see with the Azure Synapse logo, and can you point those out? That's the blue logo, Spark Pool, SQL Serverless, Pipelines, Synapse Workspace, and then obviously pipelines as well. Those are all the actual Synapse pieces. Our storage there is SQL database, but keep in mind that is a different database, and then of course Azure Data Lake Storage. If you'll notice on the left-hand side from the sources, Dynamics is the Dataverse stuff. I'm not showing Synapse Link here, which would actually go directly in, but down below I noticed the non-structured, the semi-structured, and the other, the actual structured, which is relational databases typically. All that feeds to the right-hand side. That's, again,
so
pretty strict
data sources. Yep.
Yep. And that streaming piece is completely different. I like to keep that separate, but it is allowing keeping that there. Now this is small scale data analytics. And again, by the way, that doesn't mean that your organization is going to use all these. This is only if the need drives. If we can go to the next slide and go into our big boy. And I call this our big boy because this kind of shows a full capabilities of everything that I possibly could have. I still have, it's just building on the previous slide, my streaming now. If you'll notice, I've included not only event hubs, but also IoT hubs, which is again, Azure IoT hubs, and processing in stream analytics, and cognitive services and machine learning can be fed directly from either one of that or the bottom, which is dealing with our classic data and other data sources. Again, you'll notice that it's simply moving that over. If you take a look at, and I know that this on the serving piece, I do want to concentrate on that serving piece. Power BI Premium, Azure Cosmos DB, Azure Cognitive Search, and Azure Data Share, which is that enterprise share that I talked about. All of these actually pointing out to what they would actually typically do. Our analysis or visualization is your Power BI. Applications would be your Cosmos DB or Cognitive Search, again, based off cognitive services or machine learning. I want to make sure that you do understand that all of this is sitting on top of the Azure platform and all the things they have. The governance is Azure Purview, and I have cost management, key vaults for managing security, keys, Azure Monitor, even though there's a monitor in Synapse as well. We'll talk about that in one of our pieces. Go ahead and go to the next one. So this next one is, so what tools do I use? The Synapse Workspace is that single pane of glass. And Azure Synapse Analytics, we already talked about that, so I'm jumping straight into Synapse Workspace. I apologize. And that is that studio or Synapse Studio that actually allows for me to collaborate with the other roles or provide a single pane of glass to see all of my analytics engine. The Synapse pipelines, I've already explained those, but that's the ability to ingest data not only to SQL database, but also into data lake storage or other storage mechanisms as well. It's our ETL engine or extract and load engine if I need to do it that way. The Synapse serverless SQL pools are those on-demand SQL pools within Azure Synapse. Again, I use those when I want to reduce costs, and remember they are also great for unstructured and semi-structured in data lake storage. And then Apache Spark is for the streaming analytics, if you will. Again, providing support for industry standard or industry-wide specifics. Go ahead to the next slide. I've already mentioned blob storage and data lake storage. Remember, data lake storage is simply and costs about the same as the storage piece. The other capabilities, and depending on what I'm doing with that data, may actually cost a little bit more, but it's still basically a storage cost type of situation. I did mention HD Insight, and so I've actually put out all the other Apache support that you have within HD Insight as well. It's not just Hadoop anymore. So you do have HBase, for instance, Storm, Kafka. That's also seeing something. And then what about Spark? And Spark is where I'm actually doing the processing next to the data. And that is that's a very, very powerful process, especially when I need to do parallel processing of big data as well. So those last two are the two bottom are really more for big data. Next slide, please. All right, and I mentioned obviously SQL database, event hubs. Remember, that's also I also mentioned IoT hubs at the same time, but that's that real-time data streaming. So if my analytics is dependent on real time, you did need to be looking at streaming. And for all my diagrams I had, or Microsoft's diagrams, architectural diagrams, that streaming is always across the top, as we pointed out on the slide. Stream analytics, I mentioned that's the actual real-time serverless, so container-based, right? Analytics server for the streaming data, wherever it's coming from. And then machine learning is the data science of basically your ML engine within Azure. Now, I've said all of these things around Azure Synapse. I do want to make sure, here's where it gets a little bit more, I have alternate components. I called out Azure IoT Hub when we talked about event hubs going from the basic one to the advanced one. I also mentioned Azure Data Factory first, but remember, Azure Synapse pipelines are identical underlying technology, but it's basically all managed and controlled and created through Synapse Studio. I could still use Azure Data Factory. I don't have to use Azure Synapse pipelines, but if I'm doing that, I'm obviously managing it separately. The monitoring piece, I also call this out when we were talking about Monitor. Yes, Azure Monitor monitors Data Factory. Synapse pipelines would be monitored by Synapse Monitor. So Synapse Monitor Hub within the Synapse environment or single pane of glass is the monitor for all things Synapse. If I'm looking to monitor and I start using other components outside of Synapse, obviously Azure Monitor is going to be my solution, such as Data Factory in that example that I have on the slide. And then the dedicated SQL pools I mentioned before, that is literally a dedicated. So it's just like standing up a SQL MI, a managed instance, and the cost is typically about the same type of size, if you will. Those are your alternative components. I do want to take a second. Go ahead. You can go ahead and go to the next
It's
one.
the polls next, so go ahead.
Yeah. So I do want to mention a couple things here as to what do we actually see. When do we actually see people utilizing this? So we are seeing, we've got organizations and clients, as I mentioned, that have data from multiple systems, whether it be ERP. An example would be a school or a university where they have their enrollment information in one system, their HR in another system. They have ERP outside of HR in another system, and then some significant large application platforms that have all, and the data is all in all these pieces. And for them to actually make data available or a single and analyze all that data is overwhelming. It takes meetings and a whole bunch of other things. This is some of the things that we actually help. Obviously, when we start dealing with that type of situation, governance is going to be a very key piece. I can't tell you how important it is to ensure that when you're working with analytics and especially multiple data sources, that the governance is also in place. I think that makes sense, but if you don't have a governance side, doesn't mean you can't do analytics, and it doesn't mean that you can't do governance without analytics. I do need to say that.
Sure. Wow, that was a lot of information. I know I learned a whole lot. So, and it seems like the folks on the call, 98, 90, almost, a lot of folks, everyone's saying they learned something, and some folks are looking for some other help. So that's really good to see. And I really appreciate you guys doing the polls to give us some feedback here. I'm glad to not see any unsure or not. No, I still have concern. This is really good information. I'm glad you did the poll for us here. Again, this is a lot of information. I've been working with Miguel now for the last couple weeks here, putting together this presentation. I know I learned a lot, but it does take a lot to just kind of absorb the new terminology if you're not familiar with it. There's links at the very end on this next slide. Definitely take a look at the other two blogs that Miguel has written. So this one being on analytics in the cloud, but modernizing your data estate is a great place to start. Then the one on data governance using Purview. And then here's the links pretty much to everything we talked about today in the conversation. And then if you want to get started, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Microsoft Learn, but getting started with Microsoft Data Analytics is a great little course that Microsoft Learn has available for you all, especially if you're going to try to get some certifications or something like that. It's the very foundational classes, that kind of thing. So definitely check that out. It's really cool. So at this point, we're going to open it up for questions. We did have one question. While we're waiting for questions, please get ready to ask your questions. Put them in the chat window or raise your hand. We can unmute you. We did have a couple questions that came in advance. One on topic, which was about we are building our hub and spoke architecture. What is the best way to create analytics? Miguel?
Yeah, and this is actually a really good question. In a typical hub and spoke architecture, for those that don't know, that's a subscription that I have that is a hub and acts for basically all my centralized resources. And then I have in a spoke, I have the subscriptions that handle the applications and everything else. Unfortunately, this is also not it depends kind of thing. At the very least, you're going to place your analytics in a resource group at the very least. You do have limits on both resource groups and subscriptions. So depending on what your vision is, how that's going to grow, you could place all of your analytics in a subscription that would actually have a dedicated VNet, of course. And what you do with your VNets in your hub and spoke architecture is peer them, so that you're able to utilize the centralized services in your hub, even as access from there. It's good to do that. Again, tags, if you're not using tags, and I still run across clients that haven't really implemented tags, should be definitely there as well. This will also help in organizing your cost.
Excellent. We're still, we have a few minutes of time. We got a couple more slides that we're still interested in more questions. If you have them, raise your hand, put them in the chat window. So another question I've got, Miguel, how is all this priced? Is there somewhere I can go to look for pricing on this? I mean, you may even need some help, but how would you go about doing this?
Well, the challenge here, of course, is that we're dealing with so many technologies. But the first place to start is the pricing calculator. Yes. If you go to the Azure pricing calculator, now again, even when you go to Azure and bring up Azure Synapse, it'll actually say, well, what do you want in Synapse? Do you want the dedicated SQL pool, the serverless SQL pools? So you need to understand what you're actually looking to do. And that's going to be one of the things. Azure Data Factory is going to be a separate pricing if you're going to use Azure Data Factory. Data Lake Storage is going to be separate. So all of these things are literally, if you have not used the pricing calculator, it is a great tool. And not only can you simply get it live right then and there, if you have not, you can actually save it, share your pricing, and keep that there. I've just put the link to the pricing calculator right there in the chat.
Okay. We're going to give it like a couple more seconds here for other questions that come in. We did have one question that was off topic, and again, these are cloud office hours, so you definitely feel free to ask any kind of question you want in advance. We love to get the questions in advance so we can prepare for the answers. Make sure we have the right answer for you. But one of the questions that came in was about SharePoint. How can I get a page and document views across site collections? Brooke, if you're on, go ahead and unmute, and I'll go ahead and answer that question.
So to get SharePoint Analytics, you can get it at the site collection level. At the top level of the site, there is a button that says Analytics, and it will open up and give you kind of an analytics for that page. But that's individually per site collection. There isn't like an overarching that kind of combines those. So you have to look at each site collection individually because it is its own container for data. Now, a lot of the questions we get to are, what about the documents? If you're wanting to look at the documents, you actually have to set up auditing on the documents, and then you can go in and look at the audit log to see when documents are viewed.
That makes sense. That makes sense. The audit log's got everything, right?
And a lot of times people do that with sensitive data, especially if things are in need to know information. That way they can audit to see if someone who isn't authorized to see the information had accessed it.
Excellent. Well, if we didn't answer your question fully, please feel free to reach out to us after the program today, or if you need more information about the calculator and how this all works, by all means, please reach out to us. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Casey for a second here and talk about some follow-up sessions. Casey?
Thanks, Ken, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm very excited to talk about a new expanded offering in the YouAlreadyOwnIt program. So following today's session, I'm going to be I'll drop in the chat in just a moment, a form to fill out if you're interested. But we are offering, as a follow-up to this session, 3 different data modernization strategy workshops: data analytics modernization, data platform modernization, and data governance modernization. Very, very valuable sessions on this topic, but more tailored to, of course, your environment individually. So if you are interested in that, I'll drop the form in the chat in just a moment. We'll also make sure that the form is included on the follow-up email, so you can access it there as well. But thanks again for joining, and I hope you got a lot of value out of this and take advantage of these offerings. Thanks so much, Ken. Back to you.
All right, great. Thanks, Casey.
Ken, one thing I'd add to Casey is those are free sessions. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So reach out to
Yes,
us.
yes, thank you. Yeah, I kind of buried the
Sorry.
lead there, right? Those sessions, as You Already Own It members, are no cost to you. Like everything else that we do here with You Already Own It, we're just wanting to make sure that we're providing excellent value for you. So definitely take advantage of it. Miguel, thanks for the call out there and reminding me.
Not a problem, Casey.
All right. So coming up in April, we have Pierre Eves from our organizational management team to discuss the latest and greatest on Viva, what it is all about, and what it can do for your organization about employee engagement. So make sure you tune in on April 28th at 1 o'clock. And then after that, we're still looking for volunteers. So if you've got an app that you created, we would love to have you show that app off and join us for that session. And if you're proud of something that you've created, we'd love to show it off. We're looking for about 2 or 3 folks to do that. So let us know if you're interested in doing that. We haven't scheduled a date for that. We're still looking for some volunteers. But after that, obviously, Microsoft Build's coming up, so we can do a show on talking about that. But if there's a topic that you really want to know more about, whether it be security, Azure, modern workplace, whatever it may be, some kind of new tool, let us know. If it has to do with Microsoft Office 365 or Azure, we're happy to look at possibly doing a program on it. So please reach out to your cloud executive or send a message to YouAlreadyOwnIt@go-planet.com, or obviously talk to your cloud strategist or account executive. With that, and we're wrapping up right on time. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you found this useful. See you next month.